June 1965. The airspace above the Red River Valley, North Vietnam. The air inside the cockpit of the MiG-17 aircraft was stagnant and smelled of oxidized aluminum and sweat. For the pilot, the world was a narrow, vibrating frame of glass and steel, suspended 30,000 feet above the emerald patchwork of the jungle. He was not alone. The sky was alive with the invisible electronic shrieks of radar waves, a chaotic web of signals bouncing off the limestone casts below. Ground Control Intercept, or GCI, crackled in his headset. The voice was tense, clipped, and urgent. They had a track. To the North Vietnamese Defense Network, the incoming formation was not a mystery in terms of identity, but in terms of intent. The radar signatures were massive. These were not the agile, stinging F-4 Phantom aircraft that the Vietnamese pilots had learned to respect and fear. These returns were heavy, sluggish, and moving with the relentless, plodding momentum of freight trains. They were Republic F-105 Thunderchief aircraft. The Americans called them Thuds. To the pilots of the Vietnam People's Air Force, the Thud was a target, not a threat. It was a beast of burden, a massive piece of metal designed to carry nuclear weapons in a European war that never happened, now repurposed to haul conventional iron bombs over the jungles of Southeast Asia. Intelligence briefings were clear. The F-105 aircraft was heavy. It had small, highly loaded wings that made it turn like a brick. When laden with bombs, it was vulnerable. If a MiG-17 aircraft could get within gun range, the American pilot had only two choices: jettison his entire payload to gain speed and run, failing his mission, or stay heavy and die. The Vietnamese pilot checked his instruments. His MiG-17 Fresco was a relic compared to the supersonic American jets, a subsonic gunfighter from a bygone era, but it had teeth. 3 heavy cannons in the nose and a turning radius so tight it could practically spin on a wingtip. Against a heavy bomber like the Thunderchief, the MiG was the mongoose fighting the Cobra. He rolled, the small silver jet inverted, diving through a gap in the monsoon clouds. Below him, the American formation appeared. They were 4 dark crosses against the green terrain, trailing thin wisps of black smoke. They were flying a welded wing formation, rigid and predictable. The Vietnamese pilot felt a surge of predatory anticipation. This was the standard American doctrine. They were lining up for a bombing run on a rail yard. They would be focused on their sights, straight and level, the most dangerous 4 minutes of their flight. He signaled his wingman. They would drop in from the 6 o'clock position, the blind spot. The plan was simple. Slash in, fire a burst of 37mm shells, force them to drop their bombs in panic, and then use the MiG's superior turning ability to disappear back into the clouds before the American escort fighters could react. The distance closed. 2,000 meters, 1,500 meters. The silhouette of the rear F-105 aircraft filled his gun sight. The Vietnamese pilot's thumb hovered over the trigger. He expected the American to spot him any second. He expected the sudden bloom of explosions as the Thunderchief jettisoned its bombs to lighten the load. He expected the desperate, sluggish brake turn of a terrified bomber pilot. But nothing happened. The American jets did not brake. They did not drop their ordnance. They continued on their rail-straight trajectory, seemingly oblivious to the death diving at their tails. Why aren't they running? The pilot thought. Are they blind? He closed to 800 meters. A perfect kill shot. He squeezed the trigger. The heavy cannons of the MiG-17 aircraft shuddered the airframe, sending tracers arcing toward the lead American jet. And then, the impossible happened. The F-105 aircraft did not turn. It did not shed its weight. Instead, the heavy bomber defied the laws of physics as the Vietnamese pilot understood them. In a split second, the American jet ignited its afterburner. A tongue of orange flame 20 feet long erupted from the tailpipe. The sluggish bomber accelerated with violence that seemed mechanical and cruel. It didn't just speed up. It leaped forward, leaving the subsonic MiG-17 aircraft standing still in the air. But it was the sound that followed that shattered the Vietnamese pilot's reality. It wasn't the roar of an engine. It was a tearing sound, like canvas being ripped by a giant hand. A low, guttural buzz that vibrated through the canopy of the MiG. The lead F-105 aircraft, the one that should have been running for its life, pulled up into a vertical climb while carrying thousands of pounds of bombs. It rotated on its axis, a maneuver that should have snapped the wings off a plane that heavy. The American was not running, he was repositioning. The Vietnamese pilot yanked his stick hard left, trying to use his tight turn radius to escape the trap he hadn't realized he was in. He looked over his shoulder. The heavy bomber was coming down from the vertical, diving at him. The nose of the Thunder Chief sparked. There were no missiles, no white trails of heat seekers, just an invisible wall of lead. The Vietnamese pilot's wingman simply ceased to exist. One moment, the silver MiG-17 aircraft was flying formation. The next, it was a cloud of expanding debris, shredded by something that fired faster than any gun the Vietnamese had ever seen. The air was filled with hot metal. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded the cockpit. This was wrong. The intelligence was wrong. These were not bomb trucks. These were hunters. The Vietnamese pilot dove for the deck, skimming the treetops, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had attacked a sheep and found a wolf. If you want to understand the hidden mechanics of Cold War dominance and the machines that defined it, make sure you subscribe to Cold War Impact. We decode the history they didn't teach you. Back at the command bunker near Hanoi, the mood shifted from routine to confusion. The radar operators stared at their scopes. The blips representing the MiG flight were scattering in disarray. The calm, rhythmic reports from the pilots had turned into shouting. "Target is engaging! Target is engaging!" One voice crackled over the speaker, distorted by static and fear. The senior controller, a man trained in Soviet doctrine, frowned. "Clarify," he barked into the microphone. "Is the escort engaging? Are the Phantoms attacking?" "No," the reply came high-pitched. "The bombers, the Thunder Chiefs, they are shooting us." The controller looked at the large plexiglass map table, where markers were being pushed around by assistants. The red markers representing the F-105 Thunder Chief aircraft were deep inside the engagement zone. According to every manual, every piece of technical data provided by their Soviet advisors, the F-105 aircraft could not dogfight. It was too heavy. Its wing loading was too high. It was designed to fly straight, drop a nuclear weapon, and fly home. It turned like a battleship. "Impossible," the controller muttered. "They must be Phantoms disguised as bombers." But the reports kept coming in. The surviving MiG pilots were landing, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They told stories of a heavy bomber that moved with the speed of a missile, of a plane that refused to drop its bombs, yet still outclimbed them. And they spoke of a gun that didn't fire distinct shots like their own cannons, but spewed a continuous stream of fire, a laser beam of 20mm shells. The Soviet advisors present in the room remained silent, exchanging worried glances. They knew the specifications of the F-105 aircraft. They knew it had a gun, but it was considered a secondary weapon, an afterthought for strafing ground targets. It was never intended to bring down a nimble MiG-17 aircraft in air-to-air combat. The controller walked out of the bunker and looked up at the grey sky. The rumble of distant jet engines was fading to the south. The Americans had struck their target and left. But something had changed. The equation of the air war, which had been simple mathematics agility versus weight, had just been rewritten. The heavy bombers were no longer just targets. They had brought something new into the sky, a tactic or a weapon that turned the hunter into the hunted. The Vietnamese Air Force had to know what it was. If the Americans could turn their bomb trucks into fighters, the entire defense strategy of North Vietnam was in jeopardy. They needed answers, and they needed them before the next wave of Thunder Chiefs crossed the river. July 1965, a secure hangar at the Noi Bai Air Base outside Hanoi. The air inside the corrugated steel hangar was stifling, thick with the smell of aviation fuel and the pungent metallic scent of burnt wreckage. Rain hammered relentlessly against the roof, drowning out the distant rumble of outgoing trucks, but inside, the atmosphere was quiet and forensic. A group of men stood around a jagged heap of metal resting on a flatbed truck. It was the remains of a MiG-17 aircraft recovered from the jungle floor 2 days prior. Among the Vietnamese mechanics stood a man in a plain grey uniform, distinct from the others. He was Colonel Yuri Petrov, a technical advisor from the Soviet Union. His job was to analyze American tactics and ensure the flow of Soviet equipment, missiles, radar, and jets was being used effectively. Petrov wiped the sweat from his forehead and stepped closer to the wreckage. He wasn't looking at the engine or the cockpit, he was looking at the wings and the fuselage. "Tell me again," Petrov said, his voice low, translated by a nervous Vietnamese lieutenant. "The pilot claims he was hit by a missile?" "No, Comrade Colonel," the lieutenant replied, consulting a clipboard. Pilot Nguyen stated he was maneuvering behind an F-105 Thunderchief aircraft. He was setting up a firing pass. Then, he says the bomber sparked at him. He claims he saw no smoke trail, no missile ignition, just a sudden vibration, and then his right wing disintegrated. Petrov ran a gloved hand over the torn aluminum of the MiG's fuselage. He frowned. If an AIM-9 Sidewinder missile had hit this aircraft, the damage would be catastrophic, but localized a massive explosion, shredding the tail or the engine. If it had been hit by standard machine gun fire, like the .50 caliber guns on older American planes, there would be distinct puncture marks, lines of holes stitched across the metal. What Petrov saw here defied both categories. The side of the MiG-17 aircraft looked like it had been chewed by a giant steel animal. The metal wasn't just punctured, it was erased. A section of the fuselage 3 feet wide was simply gone, the edges curled and blackened. The remaining skin was peppered with hundreds of tiny, jagged holes, concentrated in an incredibly dense pattern. "This is not a missile," Petrov muttered, pulling a small magnifying glass from his pocket. "And this is not standard gunfire." He dug a penknife into a piece of the aircraft's internal strut and pried out a flattened lump of lead and copper. He held it up to the hanging light bulb. It was a 20mm projectile, standard NATO caliber. But the quantity was the mystery. To inflict this level of damage, a standard fighter jet would need to hold its trigger down for 5 or 6 seconds, tracking the target perfectly. But the pilot's report said the engagement lasted less than a second. A snapshot. "Do the math," Petrov whispered to himself. To put this much lead into a moving target in under 1 second, the rate of fire would have to be impossible. He walked over to a table where technical manuals were spread out. He flipped open the file on the Republic F-105 Thunderchief aircraft. The data was sourced from open Western aviation journals and KGB espionage. Designation: F-Stopet. Role: nuclear strike bomber. Max speed: Mach 2. Weight: heavy. Maneuverability: low. Petrov tapped the paper. "It is a bus," he said to the Vietnamese officer. "A supersonic bus designed to carry a nuclear bomb to Moscow. It is not a dogfighter. It turns poorly. It accelerates slowly when loaded. And yet, your pilots say it is outflying them. They say the Americans are flying different planes," the lieutenant ventured. "Modified? Or we are fighting ghosts," Petrov countered. He looked back at the wreckage. "There is something missing in our data. The Americans have introduced a variable we did not anticipate." Later that evening, in the command bunker, the mystery deepened. The radar operators were tracking another American strike package. As usual, the radar signatures indicated heavy F-105 aircraft, but the intercept logs were telling a confusing story. A Vietnamese MiG-21 pilot, flying the newer, supersonic Soviet interceptor, reported engaging a flight of thuds near the Laotian border. "I have the speed," the MiG pilot reported over the radio. "I am closing for a missile shot. Distance 3 kilometers." The room listened tensely. The MiG-21 aircraft was superior in almost every metric that mattered for interception. It was lighter, faster to accelerate, and armed with heat-seeking missiles. "Target is accelerating," the pilot's voice changed. "He is diving. He is going supersonic. Stay with him," the controller ordered. "He cannot outrun a MiG-21. "He is on the deck," the pilot shouted, panic creeping in. "He is flying at treetop level. Speed is 1,100 kilometers per hour. I cannot hold the lock. The ground clutter is too high." The signal cut out as the MiG pilot broke off the pursuit, unable to safely match the terrifying low-altitude speed of the heavy American bomber. Petrov stared at the map. This was the second anomaly. Anomaly 1, a weapon that shredded aircraft with an impossible rate of fire. Anomaly 2, a clumsy bomber that could fly faster at sea level than a dedicated interceptor. The Soviet advisor lit a cigarette, the smoke curling up toward the ventilation fans. The Americans were playing a game of physics that the manual said they should lose. A plane that heavy shouldn't be able to turn tight enough to bring a gun to bear on a MiG. A plane that large shouldn't be able to race through heavy air at the speed of sound without shaking itself to pieces. "They are using the weight," Petrov realized, his eyes narrowing. "They are not fighting the air, they are forcing their way through it." He turned to the Vietnamese commander. "We need to change tactics. We have been telling your pilots to force a dogfight, assuming the F-105 aircraft is slow and weak. We are wrong. We are sending them into a meat grinder." "But what is the weapon?" the commander asked. The pilot said the nose of the plane sparked. Is it an energy weapon? Petrov shook his head. No, it is a gun. But a gun that thinks it is a hose. He picked up the flattened bullet he had retrieved from the wreckage. The mystery wasn't just the gun, it was the platform. How were the American pilots aiming a 25-ton bomber with the precision of a sniper rifle? The F-105 aircraft was known to have a primitive sight. There was no complex radar fire control like in the Navy's Phantom. They are doing it visually, Petrov concluded, which means the pilots are not just dropping bombs, they are hunting. We are not dealing with bomber pilots anymore, we are dealing with something else. The investigation was hitting a wall. The Soviet technical manual said the F-105 was vulnerable. The reality in the sky was proving that the Thud was a predator in disguise. And unless they figured out the secret of its tearing sound and its impossible speed, the Vietnamese Air Force would be whittled down, one MiG at a time. Petrov needed a prisoner, or an intact plane. He needed to look under the skin of the beast to find the heart of the machine that was baffling the Eastern Bloc's best engineers. Late 1966. The skies over Yen Bai, northwest of Hanoi. The mystery of the American bombers had evolved into a crisis. The initial confusion had hardened into a grim respect, bordering on superstition, among the pilots of the Vietnam People's Air Force. They had named the F-105 Thunderchief aircraft something new. To the Americans, it was the Thud, a derogatory term for the sound it made when it crashed. But to the North Vietnamese, who watched it absorb punishment that would disintegrate a Soviet fighter, it was the Iron Turtle. But turtles are slow. This machine was not. The Soviet advisors had adjusted their strategy. If the F-105 aircraft was dangerous in a turning fight due to its mysterious gun, and faster than a MiG-17 aircraft in a straight line, then the answer was altitude and surprise. The new doctrine was the snake in the grass. MiG-21 aircraft would circle high in the stratosphere, guided by ground controllers, and dive on the American formations like hawks, firing heat-seeking missiles before the Americans even knew they were there. It was a sound plan, until it met the reality of American electronic warfare. On a humid afternoon in October, a flight of 4 MiG-21 aircraft sat in a high orbit, 30,000 feet above the cloud deck. Below them, the radar picture showed a massive strike package of F-105 aircraft thundering toward the rail yards near the Chinese border. The MiG leader, a pilot with 3 kills to his name, watched his radar scope. He had the tone. The heat signature of the lead American jet was burning bright in his headset. He was in the perfect position, high, unseen and diving at Mach 1.2. "Fox 2!" he shouted, squeezing the trigger release for his K-13 Atoll missile. The missile dropped from the rail, its rocket motor igniting with a bright flash. It streaked toward the F-105 aircraft, a streak of white smoke tracing a line of death. The MiG pilot waited for the explosion. He waited for the blossom of fire that marked a kill. But as the missile closed in, the American formation did something inexplicable. They didn't break, they didn't flare, they simply hummed. To the naked eye, nothing happened. But in the electromagnetic spectrum, the F-105 aircraft suddenly screamed. Pods slung under their wings, pods that the Soviet intelligence officers had dismissed as auxiliary fuel tanks, erupted with electronic noise. They flooded the guidance seekers of the Soviet missiles with false targets and blinding energy. The K-13 missile, confused and blinded, wavered. Its seeker head locked onto a reflection on a cloud, then onto the sun, and finally it simply wandered off into the empty sky, detonating harmlessly miles away from the target. The MiG pilot stared in disbelief. Technological sorcery. Before he could process the failure, the prey reacted. The F-105 aircraft didn't scatter. They accelerated. The entire formation pushed their throttles past the detent, igniting their afterburners. The distinct crack of multiple sonic booms rolled over the jungle. The MiG leader realized too late that he had lost his energy advantage. He had dived to attack, and now he was in the thick, heavy air at 10,000 feet. The F-105 aircraft were right there with him, and they were angry. The Americans pulled a maneuver that defied the geometry of air combat. They were heavy, yes, but they used that weight to retain energy. While the light MiG-21 aircraft bled speed in every turn, the heavy F-105 aircraft plowed through the air like unstoppable locomotives. The MiG leader broke hard right, pulling 7 Gs, his vision graying out at the edges. He checked his 6. A Thunder Chief was there. It wasn't turning inside him, it was sliding to the outside, using a high-speed yo-yo maneuver, trading airspeed for altitude, then diving back down to cut off the angle. It was a move for a fighter, not a bomber. Then came the sound. That terrifying, ripping canvas sound. Tracers whizzed past the MiG's canopy, looking like angry red hornets. The MiG leader reversed his turn, desperate to shake the giant metal beast off his tail. He managed to spoil the American's aim, but he saw his wingman wasn't so lucky. The second MiG-21 aircraft had tried to climb away. A fatal mistake. The F-105 aircraft simply powered after him. The American jet, weighing over 50,000 pounds, climbed vertically on a pillar of fire. The nose tracked the fleeing MiG. A half-second burst from the invisible gun sheared the entire vertical stabilizer off the Soviet-built jet. The MiG tumbled out of the sky, spinning like a leaf. Back at the base, the debriefing was somber. The Soviet colonel, Petrov, listened to the pilot's accounts with a deepening frown. "They are ignoring the missiles," one pilot said, his voice trembling. "And when we hit them, they do not die." This was the second part of the twist, the durability. Another pilot, Nguyen, recounted his engagement from earlier that week. He had successfully ambushed an F-105 aircraft. He had put 37mm cannon shells, rounds the size of milk bottles, into the wing and fuselage of the American bomber. "I saw the pieces fly off," Nguyen insisted. "There was fire. Hydraulic fluid was spraying. A hole the size of a man's chest was in the right wing." "And?" Petrov asked. "And he turned and flew home," Nguyen said, shaking his head. "He engaged his afterburner and left me behind. I was flying a clean fighter. He was flying a wreck, and he was faster." Petrov walked to the window, looking out at the darkened runway. The Americans had built a paradox. They had built a plane that was too heavy to dogfight, yet was winning dogfights. They had built a plane that was a target, yet carried a gun that could saw a fighter in half in under a second. And they had built a machine so structurally redundant that you could shoot it to pieces, and it would still carry its pilot back to Thailand. The psychological toll was mounting. The Vietnamese pilots were no longer just afraid of the F-4 Phantom, the dedicated fighter. They were becoming terrified of the victims. When they saw the silhouette of the F-105 Thunder Chief aircraft, they didn't see a target anymore. They saw a trap. "They are baiting us," Petrov realized. "They fly straight to look like targets. They wait for us to commit. Then they use their speed to drag us down to the tree line, where the air is thick and our missiles don't work. And they use that gun. The gun. It always came back to the gun." Intelligence reports from the KGB had finally provided a designation for the weapon system, but the numbers were meaningless without context. M61. Vulcan. Rotary. "It is not a gun," Petrov whispered, finally understanding the mechanics of the sound the pilots described. "It is an electric motor. They are not firing bullets with gas pressure. They are driving them with an engine." The realization was chilling. The Americans had mechanized death. They weren't shooting, they were processing targets. But the final shock was yet to come. The North Vietnamese thought they were fighting a technological war, a clash of machines. They were about to learn that the F-105 aircraft wasn't just a machine. It was part of a system, a complex, integrated web of radar hunters and killers that was about to reveal its true face. The Thud wasn't just surviving the air defense network, it was being used to dismantle it from the inside out. The Iron Turtle had teeth. And it was getting hungry. Spring, 1967. The skies above the Red River Delta. The mystery that had haunted the North Vietnamese Air Force and their Soviet advisors was finally unraveling, but the truth was far more terrifying than the superstition. The impossible weapon and the suicidal tactics were not magic. They were the product of a ruthless American engineering philosophy that prioritized brute force over elegance. Colonel Petrov sat in the debriefing room holding a sheaf of classified documents obtained through espionage channels in the West. The designation of the weapon that had shredded their MiGs was finally in front of him. M61 Vulcan. "It is a Gatling gun," Petrov explained to the silent room of Vietnamese commanders. "A design from the 1860s, resurrected and attached to an electric motor." The specifications were chilling. The Soviet cannons on the MiG-17 and MiG-21 aircraft were slow, methodical weapons. They fired heavy shells at a rate of roughly 600 rounds per minute. Thump, thump, thump. If a pilot missed, he had to readjust and fire again. The American M61 Vulcan was a different beast entirely. It was a 6-barreled rotary cannon driven by a hydraulic or electric drive system. It didn't rely on the recoil of the bullet to cycle the next round. The machine forced the rounds through. This meant it never jammed in the traditional sense. If a round failed to fire, the motor simply spun the barrel assembly and ejected the dud, instantly chambering the next live round. But the real shock was the rate of fire. 6,000 rounds per minute, Petrov read, his voice flat. That is 100 rounds per second. The room was silent. When our pilots hear that tearing sound, Petrov continued, it is because the individual shots are so close together that the human ear cannot distinguish them. It is a solid wall of lead. In a 1-second burst, the F-105 aircraft throws 100 high-explosive incendiary shells at the target. They do not need to aim for a vital part of the MiG. They simply point the nose, pull the trigger, and the air in front of them becomes a solid object. The clumsy bomber was armed with a buzzsaw. The American pilots didn't need the agility to stay on the MiG's tail for long. They only needed a split-second window. If the F-105 Thunderchief aircraft swept its nose across a MiG for even a tenth of a second, the target was hit by 10 explosive shells. It was a shotgun effect applied to aerial combat. But the gun was only half of the reveal. The true shock, the strategic pivot that would define the rest of the air war, was not about the gun, it was about the mission. The North Vietnamese defense network relied heavily on the SA-2 guideline surface-to-air missile. These telephone pole-sized missiles were the terror of American pilots. They forced the bombers down low, into the range of anti-aircraft artillery. The entire strategy of North Vietnam was built on the assumption that American planes would run from the SA-2 radar signals. Then came the wild weasels. In late 1966 and early 1967, the radar operators in the SAM sites began to notice something disturbing. A new type of F-105 aircraft had appeared. These were not flying in large formations. They were flying in pairs, often ahead of the main strike force. And they were acting strangely. When a SAM site turned on its fan song tracking radar, the signal that usually sent American pilots scrambling for the deck, these specific F-105 aircraft did not run. They turned toward the radar site. The first time it happened, the SAM operator in a site near Hanoi thought the American pilot was suicidal. Target is closing, the operator reported. He is flying directly down the radar beam. The SA-2 missiles were prepared for launch. The operator waited for the tone. But before he could fire, the American plane launched a missile of its own. It was a small, fast projectile that left a trail of white smoke. The AGM-45 Shrike. The Shrike was not a bomb. It was a radar homing missile. It didn't have a camera or a GPS. It had a seeker head tuned to the specific frequency of the Soviet-built Fansong radar. It followed the invisible beam of energy right back to its source. The SAM operator stared at his scope in horror as the blip merged with his own location. "Shut down! Shut down!" the commander screamed. If they turned off the radar, the Shrike would lose its lock and go ballistic. But if they turned off the radar, they couldn't guide their own missiles. It was a game of chicken played at 600 miles per hour. The operator killed the power. The radar screen went black. Seconds later, the bunker shook violently as the Shrike slammed into the antenna array outside, turning the expensive Soviet technology into twisted scrap metal. The Americans had turned the F-105 Thunderchief aircraft into a hunter of radars. They took the airframe that could carry the heaviest load, stripped out the bombs, filled it with complex electronic warfare gear, and sent it to play tag with death. These were the F-105 Farads and F-105G Wild Weasel variants. Their motto was, YGBSM, you gotta be shitting me, which was the reaction of the first pilot who was told his job was to fly at the missiles to get them to shoot at him. The psychological impact on the North Vietnamese and their Soviet advisors was devastating. The hunter had become the prey. The SAM sites, once the invincible guardians of the sky, were now vulnerable targets. Every time an operator turned on his radar, he risked inviting a high-speed anti-radiation missile down his throat. The F-105 pilots were using their aircraft's sheer speed and durability to execute this mission. The Thud was built like a tank. It could fly at Mach 1.1 at sea level, a speed that would rip the wings off a MiG. It could take hits from 37mm flak and keep flying. The Americans leveraged these traits to create a suppression machine. In a climactic engagement in late 1967, the full capability of the Thud was on display. A flight of MiG-17 aircraft ambushed a flight of F-105 seconds, emerging from a target area. The MiGs expected the laden bombers to be slow and vulnerable. Instead, The phone 105 seconds dropped their fuel tanks and lit their afterburners. The massive J-75 engines roared, producing 26,000 pounds of thrust. The Iron Turtles accelerated away from the MiGs as if the Soviet jets were standing still. But the lead F-105 aircraft didn't just run. He pulled a high-G barrel roll, forcing the pursuing MiG to overshoot. As the silver MiG-17 aircraft slid in front of him, the American pilot squeezed the trigger on the stick. Brrr! The sound that ripped the sky was the sound of technological dominance. The Vulcan cannon chewed the MiG's right wing off at the root. The Soviet fighter snapped into a violent spin and disintegrated. Simultaneously, the electronic warfare officer, EWO, in the back seat of the F-105 aircraft, picked up a SAM launch warning. "Launch! 3 o'clock!" The pilot slammed the stick forward, pushing the heavy jet into a negative G dive toward the jungle canopy. The SA-2 missile, unable to track the diving target against the ground clutter, exploded harmlessly above them. The F-105 aircraft leveled out at treetop height, doing 700 knots faster than the speed of sound. The shockwave stripped leaves from the trees below. They were untouchable. The North Vietnamese pilots and the Soviet advisors were left with a bitter realization. The F-105 Thunderchief aircraft was not the clumsy failure they had been told it was. It was a misunderstanding of American doctrine. The Americans didn't build a plane to dance. They built a plane to brawl. They built a machine that could carry more bombs than a World War II B-17 aircraft, fly faster than sound, survive direct hits, and hunt down the very defenses designed to kill it. The shock was not a single secret weapon. It was the synergy of the system. The M61 Vulcan gun that created a wall of lead, the massive engine that allowed for sustained low-altitude speed, the advanced electronics that turned enemy radar signals into targeting beacons. By the time the Rolling Thunder campaign ended, the F-105 Thunderchief aircraft had borne the brunt of the war. They had taken heavy losses, nearly 400 were lost in combat, but they had shattered the myth of the invincible Soviet air defense network. They had shot down nearly 30 MiGs, not with missiles, but with the terrifying roar of the Vulcan cannon. The pilot who had looked out from his MiG-17 aircraft in 1965 and wondered why the heavy bombers weren't running, finally had his answer. They weren't running because they didn't have to. They were the biggest, toughest kids on the playground, and they had come to smash everything in their path. The F-105 Thunderchief aircraft was retired from combat shortly after, replaced by the F-4 Phantom and eventually the F-111 aircraft. But its legacy remained. It taught the world that in the age of missiles, raw speed, durability, and a really big gun still mattered. The Thud had earned its name, not from the sound of a crash, but from the heavy, unstoppable impact it left on history.